Today's LiveOnWeb program, the TT100 for-hire carrier rankings and forecasting the shifting business climate, is brought to you by Telligis.
Hello, and welcome to today's LiveOnWeb program on the top 100 for-hire carriers and the shifting business climate for trucking. I'm Seth Clevenger, Managing Editor of Features at Transport Topics. During today's show, we'll be discussing our newly published 2017 Top 100 list of the largest for-hire carriers in North America, which was included in the July 10th issue of Transport Topics. The sponsor for today's program is Telligis. And joining me here in the studio is Dan Berth, TT's Senior Features Writer and the architect of our Top 100 list. We'll also be hearing from some of the real leaders of the trucking industry during today's program. Eric Fuller of U.S. Express Enterprises and Derek Leathers of Werner Enterprises will talk about some of the key issues facing freight carriers today. We're pleased to welcome Eric to the show via Skype, and we'll play Dan's pre-recorded interview with Derek later in the program. We'll also get some insights from ATA Chief Economist Bob Costello about the business outlook for the year ahead. As we go, we also invite you to participate in today's program. You can email your questions or comments to share@ttnews.com, or if you're watching on the web, you can comment directly on this page. And if you're watching via Facebook Live, simply enter your question in the comment box. Now, Dan, you spoke with quite a few trucking executives in lead up and research that you did for this publication. So what were some of the main takeaways that you got from your interviews with some of the top figures in the trucking industry?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. What we found was broad optimism about business going forward, but at the same time, certain uneasiness about how to respond to this, because we know it's becoming more difficult for many trucking companies to expand their capacity because of a lack of drivers, for one thing. So, but it's pretty easy to see why they're optimistic in general about the economy, because there's a new administration that has put an emphasis on reducing taxes and regulation and boosting domestic manufacturing. These are things that are very positive for business in general and should boost demand for freight in North America, which should benefit everyone. So maybe the best way to think about this is that we're in a transition period. A lot of carriers, I think, are still hesitating to do something until they see more positive signals that the economy is going to grow. Sure. We'll get some more detail from Bob later in the program about what the data shows about the economy, but it's growing, but not as quickly as most people expect yet, right? So the current economic expansion that we've seen has been long-running, but very slow. Right. So people will be looking for some change in that pattern, and that will affect what carriers do going forward. Okay. One more thing. Sure. Just another thought to keep in mind here is that if you look back in time at periods of capacity tightness in trucking, right. 2005-06, shortly before the recession, was a very tight period. 2014 was also very good. But these periods are relatively short-lived, right, and uncommon. So if executives are planning kind of what to do about the future, they have to be careful not to overexpand, because that has been a tendency in the past in this industry, and something that could definitely alter the results of their sure. business going okay. forward. So.
Yeah, no, Eric, I want to bring you in on the conversation, and I want to get your sense on, do you expect freight demand, freight hauling demand to increase in the months ahead, in the year ahead? And if so, what are you doing to prepare for that?
Yeah, so really over the last, I'd say 6 to 8 weeks, we've seen demand start to pick up. If you look at, the way I look at it is really we've been in a freight recession for probably 18 months now, and it feels like progressively things are getting a little bit better. Now, I would put that in the context of where we've been. So if you look at it on a year-over-year basis, things are getting stronger. But if you look at it compared to maybe a typical, if you compare this June to maybe a typical June pre-2016, it was still a little sluggish. And so it's not quite to the level that we would like to see it. But we do feel like there's some momentum there. And as we've got into the first 2 weeks of July, there were previous years where typically July would be one of the worst months of the year, almost on par with the January or February. We're not seeing that this year. There seems to be some continual momentum. I think there's some things in the market that have changed. You've got Amazon Prime, Prime Day, which really, takes a lot of capacity out of the market and increases a lot of the demand. So there's a lot of things, a lot of factors that are playing into this, but we are seeing demand pick up, and we believe that will continue. Typically, as you get into that latter half of the year, demand typically does pick up, and we're fairly optimistic that that will continue.
Okay. Now, on the other side of the equation, looking at the labor market, you've pointed out that the national unemployment rate has gone down, and maybe that's making it harder for carriers like U.S. Express and anybody else really in the industry to recruit drivers into the industry. Do you continue to see that in your company, and how do you see it playing out over the next year or so?
Yeah, so I would say late 16, early 17, we saw the pool of qualified drivers, and you really kind of have to divide the driver pool up with inexperienced drivers, which would come into the industry as students and go through a school and then go through a training program, and then what we call experienced drivers typically have at least a minimum of 6-month experience. And those experienced drivers are becoming less and less plentiful in the market. So as we go out from our recruiting efforts, we're finding that there's a lot less of those drivers available, and it's making that a lot more difficult for us to attract qualified drivers. I think partially as unemployment's gone down into the low 4s, you're seeing a lot of other industries, whether it be construction or manufacturing, are pulling a lot of our drivers into those areas so that they can be home on a more consistent basis, and that's definitely affecting the market. We're not seeing it as much on the dedicated side, where those jobs are a lot more consistent, but the OTR, the over-the-road business, where drivers are typically out anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks at a time, running 48 states, typically we see that as one of the least attractive segments of our business, and we're seeing a lot of pressure in that area. So finding it more and more difficult to hire experienced drivers in that segment.
Okay. Now, I also want to touch on another hot topic that could play into freight capacity, and that's ELDs, electronic logging device mandate, goes into effect in December. So, much of the industry still is preparing for that. You guys are prepared already. You guys have electronic logs in place. But what kind of type of impact do you expect to see on the industry with ELDs? How is that going to affect capacity and also the market for drivers?
Yeah, I think the best estimate I've seen is that roughly half of the trucks out on the road do not have ELDs today, and you're really talking 4 or 5 months before they have to be compliant. I think my biggest concern is really the enforcement side of the business, and the side of ELDs is how will ELDs be enforced? How well will they be enforced? There seems to be a little confusion from my perspective on exactly how it will be enforced from an FMCSA and DOT level. And, I think from our perspective, we still have a little bit of a wait and see approach. I think if they really are enforced to the level that they need to be, it will be very impactful. I think that we could see as much as a 4 to 5% reduction in overall capacity if they are enforced at the level that they need to be. I think that enforcement will probably take some time. it's quite a drastic change from the way things have been enforced in the past. And so I think that this probably plays out further into 18 before we get that full impact. It's not going to be a December 2017, all of a sudden 5% of the market goes away. I think it's going to take a little bit longer than that, but I think there will be an impact, and then that impact will continue to be felt through 18. From our perspective on the driver's side of the business, we see it as a positive for a lot of the larger carriers, because if you look at a larger carrier like ourselves, we typically have newer equipment, we have more consistent runs, there's probably a little bit more dependability, but you've got a segment of the driving population that goes and runs for smaller carriers, and in some cases because of that flexibility, so that they don't have to have electronic logging devices, so they can have be a little more flexible, or they may just not like feeling like they have Big Brother watching them. Everybody's going to have to go to electronic logging devices, and what you're going to see is that segment of the driving population that are working for smaller carriers that have much older equipment, much less reliable equipment, less reliable maintenance, inconsistent runs. They're going to start migrating towards those carriers that have a little bit better equipment, better operations. And so we actually think that it's going to be a positive for the larger carriers as we see those smaller carriers start to struggle to find drivers as they kind of have to follow the same rules and regulations as we do.
Okay, well, thank you for those insights, Eric. Much appreciated. And, Dan, I know this was a topic that came up a lot, the topic of ELDs while you were, doing your research and writing some of the stories that are in the TT100 publication. What's some of your analysis based on what you've heard?
Yeah, it's a big issue, and it's in the back of the minds of everyone in the industry. I guess the thing that I heard most was that people are expecting to see a leveling of the playing field over time, and as Eric pointed out, enforcement seems to be the key here as to how much of an impact we're going to see and how quickly. But I think it's the thinking of most people I talk to is that yes, this will reduce capacity to some extent because we'll lose some drivers, and it will force those that are using ELDs to operate within the law more strictly, and will reduce some flexibility in terms of their scheduling. So there are implications here for shippers in terms of not holding up drivers, right? That will become a bigger issue going forward. And we'll see. I mean, one of the unknowns I think here is what happens to the data that is collected from drivers about ELDs. I think there's a sense in the industry to some extent that if we know more about the hours available for all the drivers in the marketplace, that maybe we can do a better job of matching loads and reducing some empty backhauls, that sort of thing. You can get some efficiencies out of that. Okay. We'll see, but we don't know how that's going to play out quite yet. But for another perspective on this, we're going to play an interview that I did with Derek Leathers. He's the CEO of Werner Enterprises, and Werner was the first company to adopt ELDs and has the most experience using them. So I think you'll find his comments quite interesting. If we could run that now. Hello, we're here with Derek Leathers of Werner Enterprises. Derek, thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
Let's begin with a question about the economic outlook. Most trucking executives that we've spoken to are very optimistic about what's to come, but not everyone is seeing signs yet of increased demand for freight hauling. Can you give us an idea of what you're seeing there at Werner Enterprises in terms of demand for freight hauling and maybe the outlook that you see for truckload in general in the next year?
Sure. I mean, I think we're all dealing with a little bit of mixed signals. I don't think the economy right now is real robust. I think we all recognize that there are slow kind of gradual improvements going on, and that's good news. I think as we look at it, there's no one big thing moving. I mean, it's not, you're not seeing a sudden boom in any one sector, but we are seeing slow gradual improvement. I think at the same time, though, the underlying theme is you're seeing a migration toward quality that's happening right now. So shippers and consignees around the country looking to align themselves with quality carriers, especially in advance of ELDs. And so demand is more like the weather; it's more localized right now. So those carriers that are ELD compliant, that have a quality product, like we feel we are here at Werner, we're seeing pretty good demand. And so our demand's been strong. Bookings have been strong. It's been somewhat difficult at times to square with the broader economic data, because the economic data isn't particularly robust. But I think that's a combination of a diversified portfolio, both in products, but also in customer types. And so although, for instance, we are roughly 50% retail, within that retail sector, we do a tremendous amount of work in discount retailers, dollar stores, people that really survive well in good and economic times and are doing well. So the individual customer stories that we've aligned with are strong ones right now. So that's been a benefit. And again, I can't overstate it enough. Despite all the rhetoric out there around ELDs, from some that say it's a non-issue, clearly customer and shipper behavior seems to be taking it serious as it relates to market share shifts to carriers that are fully compliant and have a long track record like Werner Enterprises does.
Yeah, and that's interesting. As you say, Werner has probably the most experience of any carrier in using ELDs. It would be interesting, I think, for our audience to hear a little bit more about how you think that has affected your own operations in terms of productivity, let's say, and what you think is going to happen to the driver market going forward as these things are implemented for everyone.
Yeah, so starting with a little of the history, we were the first carrier in America to convert to electronic logging devices. We have a 20-year plus history with them, and are approaching 18 billion miles delivered with electronic logging in place. So we have a tremendous amount of history. That's both good and bad. It means we're uniquely prepared for this transition. It means when we start talking about the productivity impact of them, we're going back a couple of decades into our history books to really kind of analyze that. But what we saw, and what we think most large fleets have seen as they convert, is in the neighborhood of 3 to 6% type productivity hit during the conversion phase. The conversion phase was really defined at each carrier, I think, by how quickly they adapt the new technology, how quickly they integrate it. But for us, if you kind of take the midpoint of call it 4.5%, we lived with that productivity hit for about a year. Coming out of that first year, that hit started to decline. We started to adapt better and utilize that electronic information better. And by really around year 3, we were back to neutral and really have seen it as a positive since then. So said differently, what we believe is that with 50% of the industry not yet converted, that 50% will likely see somewhere in that same neighborhood, probably closer to the high end of 6%, just giving the fact that if they haven't converted at this point, there's a variety of reasons for that. It could be technology constraints, capital constraints. It could be that drivers are running more miles than can be done on electronic logs. And as that conversion happens, I think they'll see 5, 6, 7% type impacts, maybe a little greater. But that's only half the industry. So divide that number by half, we think somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5% to 5% total impact industry-wide is what we'll see as we get closer to the deadline. Time will tell. We've been consistent on that number for the last year and a half whenever asked. Nothing's changed my view of that number. We've read many of the different analytical reports that have come out, and none of them have convinced me otherwise. So I think that kind of impact is coming.
Okay. And obviously some impact on capacity as that plays out.
Yes, certainly. I mean, when you take miles out, it's the same as taking trucks out. So it's really a 3% on the low end, I think, type impact to capacity. And for viewers' perspective, Werner is less than 1%, just shy of 1% of the industry. So, it's 3 to 4 Werner Enterprises kind of worth of capacity leaving the market as we convert. But it's the right thing to do. We need to be on a level playing field. We need all of us to be operating legally. And that way we can, with data, start to argue about whether or not hours of service should be changed over time. And I argue that it should be. But until we can prove that we're all operating legally, it's a difficult argument to make.
How would you like to see it changed? I'm just curious.
Well, I think there's things in hours of service that are well intended. I mean, we've already gotten one of the most important changes done, which was the elimination of the 1 to 5 a.m. Reset. The need to shut down trucks and then put them on the road during rush hour traffic. That's one that's well intended. It's focused and its intent was to make the roads safer. Its outcome was that it did not. And when we see that, we have to adapt, and we shouldn't just leave a rule in effect if it's not having the intended safety benefit. Arguably, one of the things that makes it very difficult for our drivers is, some of the mandatory 30-minute breaks. It's hard to manage fatigue. You can't legislate fatigue. Fatigue is a very personal thing. And so I'd rather see a world where drivers are able to rest and take breaks when they need them versus mandating 30-minute breaks at prescribed times that may come when they're perfectly rested and may not be available when they actually need one later. And so, there's some tweaks that I think could be made over time to allow drivers more flexibility as long as we know they're operating legally and well within the grander scheme of hours of service, and eliminating some of these mandated breaks. One of the concerns we've always had on the 30-minute mandated break is the idea that accidents happen most frequently when parking, when slow maneuvering, when entering and exiting highways. Yet we're doubling the requirement of those very activities in every driving shift by adding this 30-minute break in, and drivers generally don't like it either. And so I'm not saying we're out there beating the drum to change it, but it's something on our radar that we'd like to have as an open dialogue post ELD conversion.
For conducting that interview, Dan, with Derek. I think it was very insightful. And I want to go ahead and get to a viewer question now before we get too much deeper into the program. So Eric, I was going to bring you back into the conversation here. You have a question about whether or not carriers are going to be more aggressive in trying to obtain drop and hook freight. Can you speak to that?
Yes, so we typically, a majority of the freight that we have today is drop and hook. I think that does help utilize from a driver's hours perspective, gives you a little more flexibility. It also, though, hinders you a little bit on the other side. Most of us have large brokerage operations, so that flexibility that we have with brokerage is somewhat, it's harder to do when you have preloaded trailers or drops on the backside of the delivery. So we try and balance that as much as possible. We don't think that we'll ever get to a point where we have 100% preloaded and drop on the backside, just because it doesn't necessarily make sense for our network. So we like to have kind of a mix. But I do think that some carriers that haven't pushed for that in the past will probably see that as an advantage and push for it more. Now, obviously, that there's a cost that comes with that. You can't go 1-for-1 on a trailer ratio or even 1-for-2. You really typically got to have 3 trailers for every truck that you have. So there's an added cost to being able to operate like that.
Sure. Oh, and as a reminder to our viewers, you're watching Live on Web. And as we go, we invite you to ask your questions and share your comments as we discuss our top 100 for-hire carriers list and the shifting business climate for trucking. So you can email your questions or comments to share@ttnews.com, or if you're watching on the web, you can comment directly on this page, and if you're watching via Facebook Live, simply enter your question in the comment box. So another hot topic in the industry I'd like to address is the issue of consolidation. So I'll start with you, Dan. What have we seen there, and what do you expect to see in the months and really the year ahead?
Sure. I think many people expect to see more consolidation. We've always had some in this industry, but the feeling now is that, particularly in the truckload sector, is that the time is right to see more of it. So I think we'll see more examples of roll-ups like we've seen with Dasky, for example, which has bought 9 or 10 flatbed carriers and now is the second largest provider of flatbed heavy specialized service. That the history of roll-ups hasn't been perfect in this industry. There have been some spectacular failures, but this one seems to work in part because he's buying good companies that don't need to be fixed, and
For sure.
so I think we'll see other people sort of imitate that
Okay.
that model, right? Buy good companies and put them together and help them operate more efficiently. I think we'll see Schneider be more active. This is an iconic company in the industry that went public earlier this year, and as a public company, there's always pressures. Maybe Eric can comment on this a little bit. He's been public and private, but growth is one of the things that investors look for, and Schneider has, I think, an interest in increasing its presence in both truckload and intermodal markets. They started a final mile delivery business after making a couple acquisitions last year. So I think they want a piece of the e-commerce pie.
Sure.
So we'll see them do some things, I think. The most prominent transaction this year has been the combination of Knight and Swift. And what's interesting about that deal is that Kevin Knight wants to keep both of these companies separate, even though they're combined into one ownership group. That will be interesting to see how it plays out, because obviously one of the benefits of consolidation is that you have less overhead, and you don't have to duplicate some of your operations. But if you're going to keep everything separate, maybe you don't get those economies of scale. So we'll see. Just in the last week, we heard about Heartland Express buying Interstate Distributor.
Right.
We'll see more transactions like that, where companies are buying companies that complement what they currently do, and that's a good example of that. As I said, big has some certain advantages. I don't know, Eric, would you feel like commenting on what it's been like to operate as both a public-owned and a private company? Has it made much of a difference in your strategy in terms of mergers and acquisitions, for example?
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt, in regards to acquisitions. I think that if you look at the history of U.S. Express, we did 28 acquisitions. Most of those were while we were a public company. Since we have gone private, we haven't done any acquisitions. And I think the way we would look at acquisitions in the current environment is if there's just a really good fit, or if there's a niche that maybe we wanted to get into that we're not participating in today, then we would probably look at an acquisition. I think you look at it differently as a public company. I think, as you mentioned, Schneider, I think that companies like that are continuing to having to grow their revenue, grow their profit, and so acquisitions are a good way to do that. When you look at a valuation and they're able to really buy a company and be accretive overnight, it really makes sense for them. So I think you'll see a lot of the public guys continue to be fairly active in the M&A market, particularly looking at private companies and purchasing those or rolling them into their operations. I do have some comments, as you mentioned, on the Knight and Swift piece. One of our strategies, as I mentioned, we had 28 acquisitions. We used to roll those companies into our operations, and we found that to be very fraught with a lot of issues. We had a lot of problems with systems. I mean, you typically have different systems, you have different processes, you have different ways, you have different cultures, you have different ways of doing things. So it becomes very difficult to integrate those two companies. And our last couple of large acquisitions, we actually ran separate, similar to how Knight and Swift plan to run, and did not integrate those two companies. I actually think that's a preferable way to do it. It's a lot less risky way to do it, and maybe down the road, as you start to share some systems and share some best practices, then maybe that combination and integration becomes a lot easier. But I think initially running almost two separate companies is probably pretty prudent, in my opinion.
Okay.
Well, if I could follow up, Eric, if you're not making acquisitions at the moment, how do you see your company changing over time? Are you are you comfortable with the size you are today, or do you see in the future a company that is bigger, more diverse, perhaps participating in markets beyond North America? Just how do you see the future for U.S.
Sure.
Express?
So we're 40% dedicated today. We would like to see some growth in that dedicated arena to get to around 50 to 55% dedicated. So that's probably growing another 20 to 25% in dedicated, while we will continue to grow within our over-the-road division. We think most of our growth will be done organically. We believe that as we get into the ELDs and then some of the other headwinds that are going to occur in the market relative to especially smaller carriers, that there will be significant market share available for those that are growing. And we would, at this point, think that we can take advantage of those opportunities organically.
What about intermodal? Is that an area you are interested in growing in or not?
I'd say that ship has sailed.
Oh.
I think that, if you look at intermodal, that's a tough market if you don't already have the deals and the contracts with the railroads. I think it's really tough to get in this late in the game. So, we do it a little bit within our brokerage division, but don't envision us going in and buying containers and really getting involved on a large scale on rail.
All right, thank you very much. One of the things we've seen some interest by truckload carriers in doing is looking at ways to automate maybe their businesses, and Eric, this includes the possibility, I suppose, of self-driving trucks in the future. U.S. Express was featured very prominently recently with the introduction of the Nikola electric truck. Can you give us an update on that technology and what you see coming in terms of what's viable in terms of applications for self-driving trucks?
Yeah, so we're really excited about the new technology. I think that if you look out 5 years ago, there were hardly anybody talking about autonomous trucks, and now I think everyone realizes that that's something that's going to happen at some point, in the fairly near future. So I think in part, I don't know that we can even predict what the new technology that's going to come down the path in the next 5 to 10 years. But I do think there's going to be some interesting pieces, and I do think electric trucks plays into it. You mentioned the Nikola. You've also got Tesla that's very involved in trying to produce an electric truck. So those companies will probably be producing a truck within the next 2 to 3 years. At what point does it become mass produced to the point where you start to see them regularly out on the road? Maybe a couple years after that. But I think that technology is almost there today. So you'll start to see those trucks out on the road, which is going to change the landscape. I mean, it's going to change if you don't need to go to truck stops, you don't need to fuel. I mean, how does that change the life of a driver and how we operate today? So I think those are going to be some significant changes. It'll be interesting to see how all that evolves. I think on the other side, on the autonomous side, is over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have a lot of driver assist technology. And why I call it driver assist, because the driver will still need to be in the truck. And, you can look at it like an airplane or like the railroad. You still have somebody in the vehicle, and that will continue, I think, for the near future, where maybe the truck can drive itself on the interstate, but you still have the driver in there monitoring systems, will take control when need be, driving off the interstate, going to the origin and the delivery and that type of stuff. The predicted fully autonomous, no driver in the truck, the truck's driving itself, I still think is 20 to 25 years out. Now, what I'll say is, though, the true technology to make that happen will probably occur before that. But I think you've got regulatory issues. I think you got infrastructure issues. So it's not so easy as just to say that once the technology's there, that we just start to see those trucks out on the road, I don't think it's going to be that easy. So I think that you're probably looking 20 to 25 years before you start to see trucks out on the road without a driver. And even then, it's probably not going to be as widespread as everybody anticipates, at least for a while.
Yeah, thanks for your insights there, Eric. I mean, that's certainly a topic of great interest to the industry, and has certainly been keeping me personally busy, covering all the developments there. And I fully agree that we're really looking at more of an evolution than a revolution, where we see more advanced driver assist, eventually leading to higher levels of automation. And it's certainly fascinating to watch, more and more companies getting into trucking, technology developers getting into trucking, looking for a way to make that happen. Now, to shift gears a little bit here, we also, I think, want to circle back to a broader look at the overall economy and trade. And Dan, you recently spoke with Bob Costello, chief economist at American Trucking Associations, and he had a number of thoughts and gave you a pretty good update on some of the latest developments. So let's go ahead and play that interview.
Hello, I'm Dan Berth. I'm Senior Features Writer for Transport Topics, and I'm here today with Bob Costello. He's the Chief Economist at American Trucking Associations. And Bob, we're going to talk a little bit about the Top 100 feature and your outlook for the economy. Many of the trucking executives I spoke with are very optimistic about business this year.
Good.
But not everyone is seeing an uptick in business just yet. So what should we be looking for in terms of signs that the economy is improving, and how will that translate into more freight this year?
Yeah, that's good, and I'm not surprised that you say that about fleets. I see the same thing, right? I mean, and hear the same thing. So what's going on with the economy is we are going to see a general improvement, a moderate improvement, though. We're going to go from 1.2% GDP growth in the first quarter to about 3% in the second quarter, and then high twos, mid twos after that for the rest of the year. That yields you a 2.3% GDP gain for the year versus 1.6 last year. So that's the good news. The bad news is it's not all uniform, right? I mean, we're starting to see the consumers hanging in there, not too bad. But if you're on the auto side of it, auto sales are starting to just, moderate a little bit, and we're starting to get a glut of inventories in autos. Manufacturing's definitely starting to creep up. That's good. But even if you peel back those numbers, you got machinery and computers, that's doing well. But if you're in apparel and so forth and textiles, that's terrible. It's going to fall 3% this year. Construction, if you're looking at home construction, not too bad. Even commercial construction, not too bad. Road construction and so forth hasn't done too much. So, and I guess the last thing I'd say is, and I think this is probably the best thing going forward, is the glut of inventories throughout the supply chain is starting to come down. It's been really slow and gradual, but that's held back trucking. And once we get those inventories down a little bit more, I think you'll see a more general increase. But trucking, we haul the vast majority of goods. Some parts are doing well, some parts aren't going to do well. So I'm not surprised that you heard that not everybody's participating yet in a little bit better economic growth.
Yeah. Could you maybe comment a little on what infrastructure might mean for trucking? Because I know we haven't seen a final plan yet, and so maybe we're still waiting to see how much money will be spent on infrastructure. But is that one area where you are optimistic about seeing an increase this year?
We're very happy that the administration's talking about this, right? I mean, we desperately need it. I think everybody knows that, right?
Yeah.
And it is some of the best government spending you can do, right? It is, when you build, anything with infrastructure, the money go there. Because it yields dividends for years to come, right? And so that's the good news. I guess we'll have to see what it looks like in the end, but I think the mere fact that we're talking about it is very much a positive for the trucking industry, and that, when it gets going, will generate a lot of freight.
Mm-hmm. All right. We can hope.
Yeah.
Now, while many executives are optimistic about growth, it's also true that they're having trouble providing additional capacity, in part because they have a problem getting enough drivers, which is not a new problem at all, certainly, but unemployment nationwide is down to levels that I used to think was considered full employment.
Right.
Maybe it isn't anymore, but what can carriers do to meet the additional demand for freight hauling? And maybe on the same lines, are you concerned about what may happen after this year with the implementation of this new electronic logging mandate in December?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the unemployment rate is down to levels we haven't seen in 16 years, right? You are now, we've always talked about a truck driver shortage, but you are now hearing other industries that we've never really spoken about a shortage in these areas that are talking about labor shortages. So that's just going to make it more difficult for trucking companies to recruit new people into this industry. And that's going to be tough. And then you throw on top of that the electronic logging device rule, which we think needs to happen, and it's going to happen. But we do know it does skim off a little bit of productivity off the top. So that means you got to have, I don't know what the number is, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I don't know what it is, but somewhere in that range, % more trucks to haul the same amount of freight. It means you need to have more drivers. So, the last time we looked at the driver shortage was in late 2015. At that point, the driver shortage was about 48,000. We didn't calculate it last year, but if I had to guess, it's still difficult to recruit drivers, but if I had to guess, it was probably the same or a little bit lower as we were going through a mini freight recession, I'd call it. But that's not the long-run trend. The long-run trend is for it to get worse again. And then you throw on this competition. Another way with other industries, another way to look at it is if you go back to 2010, there were 7 to 7.5 unemployed people for every job opening. Today, there are less than 1.5 unemployed people for every job opening out there. And this is for the entire economy. So that pool of potential drivers just continues to get, constrict. And as construction booms and manufacturing picks up, we're going to have a lot more competition. So I don't know that I have an answer for the fleets exactly, what they're going to do. And I always say it doesn't matter what you're short. If you're short bottled water, what happens to the price of bottled water? It goes up. You're short truck drivers, what happens? Their pay is going to go up. I mean, that's the natural market reaction to any shortage. So I think as a fleet, you can anticipate it to get more aggressive as we go through this year, get closer to that ELD mandate, and then beyond that, I wouldn't, unless we somehow go into a recession, which we don't see at this point, it's going to get more aggressive out there for drivers.
All right. Something else that some executives are concerned about is what might change with trade policy in this country. Right. There's talk about reopening the North American Free Trade Agreement with the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Should they be worried at this point? And is there a chance that whatever losses there might be on the trade side might be made up for with increases in domestic manufacturing?
Well, let me just start off by saying I understand the concern. I mean, I was concerned too. Still am. If you go back and look how this industry has benefited from NAFTA, it's astounding to me. And this is why our president and CEO, Chris Spear, always says trucking and trade are synonymous. Okay, so if you go back, total truck transported NAFTA trade has increased 164% since 1995, with U.S. exports going to both Canada and Mexico up 153%. If you look at just Canada, it's grown 76% total trade, truck transported trade, and exports up 83% to Canada via truck. The southern border is even more impressive. Total truck transported trade up 372% since 1995. 344% increase in U.S. exports by truck to Mexico. So when you look at, I recently did an analysis where we looked just at the Mexican trade via truck. We have in this industry 26,000 direct jobs from trade with Mexico, including 17,000 U.S. truck drivers, right? And that generates $3.7 billion a year. So where does that lead us, right? So we recently, filed comments with the U.S. Trade Representative on opening up NAFTA and said, and we had 5 main points, right? One is do no harm, right? This industry has benefited tremendously. It's okay to update NAFTA. Let's not do any harm though, right? So that's one. And then there's other things like commingling of freight on the southern border. Right now you have to have one, the trailer can only have goods from one Mexican truck broker. That needs to change, right? That's outdated. Keep the NAFTA trucking provisions. Why not allow, I'm not talking about freight, but why not allow drivers from all 3 countries, within all 3 countries, to be able to haul empty trailers, right? That's what the practice is in the U.S., right? It's drop and hook. Let them pull out empty. So we think they should allow that. And then just generally, let's improve border efficiency. Now the good news is, for the people that we're worried about that you spoke with, is I do think some of the rhetoric has come down. I think it's realized that you can't just decouple this thing, right? That this is, the supply chains are set up. So if we do no harm and update NAFTA, I think it can benefit everybody, and hopefully that's the direction. It will be an aggressive timeline. It's going to be from mid-August to, right now, the mid-December, might go to mid-January, but if it goes much longer than that, I don't know what's going to happen, because the Mexican presidential elections are in about a year from now.
I see. So let's get it done now.
Yeah,
if we're going to do
that's
anything,
what the plan is. Well, I mean, it's a big agreement, so we'll have to see what happens. But they do have a very aggressive timeline starting in August.
Do you feel like the administration has heard that message and will respond appropriately?
We're hopeful.
Yeah, hopeful?
Yeah.
Good. All right.
All right, welcome back. Thanks again to Bob for taking the time for that interview. Now, one of the points that he made there at the end pertained to the future of global trade agreements, in particular NAFTA. Now, Eric, I wanted to ask you about that as well. Do you have any concerns about potential changes to NAFTA? And let me also combine this with a question we got from a viewer who asked us about how much growth we expect to see in the cross-border business between U.S. and Mexico in the months ahead and really in the coming years. Your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, so we own an operation called Express International, which is 350 to 375 trucks running in the interior of Mexico. It's all cross-border shipments. So we have a lot of exposure to that market, and are a little concerned at some of the rhetoric coming out of the government. I think that the way we look at it is a lot of that was done during the election. And now, as we see it, we don't see as much of that, at least to the level that we were hearing prior to the inauguration. We're not seeing that in Washington. I think they've got enough issues that they're trying to work through that doesn't seem to be one of the biggest issues that they're dealing with. And we're hoping that that's something that slowly and slightly goes away, because I do think that if they really start to affect trade with Mexico, then that's really going to greatly impact that market. But I think as we look at it today, we're less and less concerned than we even were 6 months ago, because it just doesn't look as likely they're going to get something done there.
Okay.
We do think as we go forward, though, I think that there's still a little wait and see. I think if you look at some of the manufacturers that at one point were moving to Mexico, that seems to be on hold, at least for those that were moving from the U.S. to Mexico. I think we'll probably still continue to see those that were moving from, say, China and the East that'll continue to move back, and a lot of those will probably move to Mexico. But that migration from the U.S. to Mexico seems to be halted for the time being.
Okay. Yeah, will be certainly be interesting to watch, and we'll see if that kind of falls by the wayside on here in Washington, or if it resurfaces. Now, I would like to turn back to the top 100 list for a moment. Now, for those of you who are watching who haven't seen it in print yet, I will say that we're preparing to post it online as well. So later this week, you should be able to view our updated 2017 rankings for the largest for-hire carriers in North America. So stay tuned and check out ttnews.com for that. And Dan, I want to ask you about some of the changes to this year's top 100. and sector lists. So what's different? What's unique about this year's list?
One thing that I think everyone should pay close attention to is what's going on at the top of this list with UPS and FedEx. Now, for years, both companies have dominated, the marketplace in terms of freight transportation. They're so much bigger than any other company. But now you see the gap between UPS and FedEx narrowing quite substantially, and this is primarily due to FedEx's acquisition last year of TNT Express in Europe. So they're within $3 billion of each other, and if you're doing $60 billion a year, that's not much. Both companies have been making deals and getting into some brokerage business and some logistics related business. Both are building out their networks to handle more e-commerce package volume. So we have a very intense competition between two of the very largest companies, and that'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Sure.
Sure. And,
okay.
Yeah.
I want to get to a couple more of our viewer questions before we run out of time here. We have a question from Tom Anderson of Contract Freighters, Inc. How is technology impacting carriers' ability to grow in today's market? Maybe I'll kick that one to you, Eric. What role is technology playing, at U.S. Express, and is it having an effect on your ability to expand?
Yeah, it absolutely does, and I think the expectations of the shippers are just getting even further. They're wanting to see real-time tracking. They're wanting to see where their loads are in transit. They're really looking for a lot of technology that a lot of the big carriers can provide and brokers can provide. I mean, I think even now that Uber's come in on the taxi side, and you can actually watch it drive down the road and come to your house, I think that we're seeing more and more shippers go, well, if they can do that there, then why can't I do the same on my shipments? Why can't I watch that truck? And so we're seeing more and more requests for that type of technology, tracking technology. But I think it's further than that. I think that as more and more technology comes on, I think that the larger carriers will adopt the newer technology at a larger, quicker pace. And as more technology happens, I think that actually will continue to divide the haves and the have-nots. And the larger carriers are probably going to continue to get market share because they have some of the technology that some of the smaller carriers can't afford.
Okay. And I also have a question that I'd like to direct to you, Eric, dealing with maintenance. In your opinion, what is the most challenging maintenance issue facing fleets today? Thoughts on that?
A couple of years ago, it was related to the 2010 emissions when those drastic changes came into the EPA emission standards, and we had to have DEF and those type of things, EGR. That was a drastic change and really caused a lot of issues for a number of years. I would say we're really past that now. I think now, and I think it kind of ties into the question beforehand, I think it's about adapting technology. We're seeing technology around tire inflation. We're seeing technology around trailers. I mean, who would have thought that there was innovation that was to happen in trailers? But we're seeing aerodynamic innovation and a lot of other technology around trailers and how that integrates with the tractor. So it's really interesting, and that is probably changing the dynamics of maintenance. Beforehand, the skill set you were looking for is somebody that could turn a wrench. More and more, it's going to be somebody that understands how to work on electronics. And I think as we get into electric trucks, I mean, you may even be hiring more electricians than you are mechanics. And so I think it's definitely changing the dynamics within maintenance itself.
Okay, and it looks like I have time to squeeze in one last viewer question from Bert Epps with High Plains Logistics Consulting. He's asking about the ELD mandate and the effect that it will have on the U.S. economy as a whole. His thoughts are that it'll lead to rapid inflation Carriers could see an improvement in rates as a result of ELDs, but it could ultimately lead to increased costs for consumers. Your thoughts on sort of the big macroeconomic picture. What will ELDs mean for the U.S. economy as a whole?
Sure. I think if you look at large shippers, large retailers, you get into your Walmarts and your Amazons and your Procter & Gamble's, that their transportation spend is such a small percentage of their overall cost of goods. So I don't think even if it leads to rate increases of 10 or even 15%, that you're going to see that really affect the price of goods in large scales. I don't think that's going to have that kind of a effect on the economy. I think where there could be an effect on the economy is if we start to see economic growth really take off, and I think some of that's going to be dependent on Washington getting some of their initiatives done. But if we see economic growth really take off, and some of the most extreme expectations around ELDs, where you get anywhere from 6 or 8 or even 10% capacity gets pulled off the road, then capacity within transportation could actually be a hindrance to GDP growth. And that's something that's been predicted in the past, is that if you get into 3.5%, 4% GDP growth, that could end up affecting the lack of supply in the trucking market, could actually end up kind of tampering things down a little bit from a GDP growth standpoint. I think that's where you would have your most impact. I don't think that it's going to have an impact on an inflationary standard. I think inflationary, there will be a lot of other factors that'll go into it, and transportation will be a very small part of that.
Okay. Thanks for your take on that. This has been a great discussion, but looking at the clock, and that's going to do it for today's show. So Dan and I would both like to thank Eric Fuller of U.S. Express, as well as Derek Leathers of Werner Enterprises and Bob Costello of ATA for their participation in today's show. We'd also like to extend special thanks to Telligis for sponsoring the program. Now, if you missed part of the show or would just like to watch it again, a replay will be posted later today on our website, ttnews.com, and on liveonweb.ttnews.com. Our next Live on Web program is scheduled for August 23rd, when we'll take a look at the fast-approaching ELD mandate and how it will affect the industry. So, can't get enough ELDs. And until then, thank you for joining us.